A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome once again to Films I Should Have Talked About years ago. Now, this is actually something a little different than I had done, not only because this is a film centered on real events, but it's also a film centered on video games, but not just any, something that's been around for about 40 years now. And even more so, the true events and the video games in question all correlate to one well-known puzzle game that had been around since even before the Game Boy, Tetris. Yeah, so Tetris the film, in this instance, is something that I've been wanting to talk about for a little while now, especially having watched it. But only when I got this season of Films I Should Have Talked About years ago started, it finally came time for me to eventually start bringing up the courage to talk about this film, because in all honesties, for a film that is centered upon the likes of the many events that led up to the development and release of Tetris, was quite an ordeal. You probably know by now that Tetris was something that was put together by the Soviet Union. More specifically, a Russian programmer came on together in order to, in fact, create a unique puzzle game. Alexei Pajitnov, whom of course was played by an actual Russian actor, Nikita Efremov, he goes on to basically create history. Probably one of the few times in which that the Soviet Union had actually made something on the more positive level. Though, when looking back, you could probably understand why it was what it was. The culture of the country had greatly changed since its involvement in World War II. And of course, when the leadership of Joseph Stalin came around, this is of course what led to Russia becoming the Soviet Union. It officially would be a name etched on maps, etched on atlases, etched on the web even. But over time, the country of Russia has simply been regarded as its true name, Russia. Especially on account of the fact that the days of the Soviet Union came to an end by 1991. More than 46 years since the end of World War II came around. Anyways, though, in this film we have ourselves not just Alexei, but also the man behind it all, the co-founder of Bulletproof Software, Hank Rogers, who in this film is played by Taron Egerton, whom we had already known in other films like Rocket Man, where he played the one and only Elton John. But he would later go on to be in a Netflix film the following year in 2024 known as Carry On, which itself was quite an ordeal, on a different level, thankfully. But the whole idea of Tetris mainly came around as to events in the 1980s, not just with the success of Tetris, but also the massive problems that came around, because in the United States, or in this instance, Hank Rogers, of course, is a man whom was born Dutch, moved to the States, and then moved to Japan with his wife and daughter. So, he's kind of like with me, you know. I was born in one state, moved to another, and I pretty much have good relationships going on here in Wisconsin. And a life figured out, thankfully, so I probably don't have to go much further than where I currently am at this point. But you never can tell. Anyways, though, Hank Rogers and the entirety of Bulletproof Software had basically gone through the likes of some unique puzzle game showcases at a Las Vegas convention, to the point where he would receive word about the idea of a puzzle game that was actually made by a Russian programmer. As mentioned before, Alexei Pajitnov was in fact a man who was responsible for making a lot of headlines in the Soviet Union, because this unique addictive puzzle game that he created called Tetris was in fact so big that Hank Rogers himself felt convinced that he wanted to take advantage of the game itself and create rights outside of the Soviet Union to sell his game and help him achieve more profits, while also getting some profits for himself. Because, as the events of the movie would tell us, he was having a bit of a hard time in Japan, with basically trying to get a living and, of course, trying to maintain his company, Bulletproof Software. Even when discussing things with Nintendo executives, he, of course, couldn't exactly put the rights together to get a game like Tetris released. for their consoles or otherwise, and it's mostly because the licensing deals just weren't through all the way. Meanwhile, there were certain acquaintances that came from the UK whom were also trying to get Tetris on board in the hopes to make their own share profits. But while it's its own separate company and its own separate group of people that of course we'll be talking about later on, mostly Hank Rogers is just up to visiting the Soviet Union himself and getting on down to Elorg, basically the company responsible for a number of different things in the computing industry or otherwise. Elorg was in fact the one corporation in the Soviet Union at the time that was practically running a lot of computing and a lot of electronic related entertainment, including their ownership of Tetris. Because even though Alexei made the game himself, he wasn't exactly in full control of the ownership. But that's just what happens when you have such a certain country like the Soviet Union. Russia nowadays has thankfully gotten a lot better in the last 40 years. But that's not to say it has fully changed for the better. Nonetheless though, Hank Rogers is a man who is determined to do whatever it takes. He even meets up with a local in the area known as Sasha. And in this instance, while played by Sofia Lapideva, she also does a unique job, being that has some Russian in her blood and therefore can really pull off a convincing dialect and is able to say the Russian language in a really fluent manner. So, between all the actual Russian actors and the people whom are trained well to speak and or learn Russian in many ways, you got yourself quite a deal here that really pays a lot of attention to detail. On top of being an Apple TV exclusive, I feel like that this is also something that's more than worth checking out if you have yourself a subscription to it. In any case though, Hank is at first turned down by executives of Elorg, including various leaders of the Soviet Union itself. But what happens is that we do get ourselves a number of different things that will go around. We got Hank going in and out of various places, visiting Elorg, heading back to his apartment, visiting Alexei Pajitnov when he finally gets a chance to go there, and a number of different things just dwindle down to a point where it feels like hope would eventually be lost. He of course would try to make his way back to the country which he came from, especially after being threatened a few times by these high leaders of the Soviet Union, including a man known as Valentin Tritonov. But other than that though, he eventually comes to the conclusion. And the fact is that after some more problems happen, even Alexei and his partner are not exactly having a great time out there. So they eventually work things out, where Alexei and Hank are able to finally get to the point where they're able to convince Elorg to start allowing for licensing to go on. Hank is officially trying to go for the portable licensing because of the success of the Nintendo Game Boy at the time. At the same time, however, there was also the likes of the rival company that came around from the UK, of which that supposedly, compared to the United States, which is actually more of Japan, by the way, since that is where Hank Rogers is officially living at the point. The UK's end of the deal here, including the likes of the Maxwells, you definitely had yourself quite a battle here. It's the US/Japan, England, and Russia, all vying together to get themselves a good deal made with the Soviet Union and the rights to Tetris overall. But there's one little problem that goes around. There was of course that little agent of which that the Maxwells have, Howard Stein, whom is also a well-known face that the likes of Hank Rogers, he knows him pretty well there, but Robert Stein, for the most part, is a man who has unfortunately leaked out a bit of a secret. A secret of which that would eventually force Soviet leader Gorbachev to basically drop the ball onto the heads of the Maxwell family, basically killing off their deal while at the same time allowing for the deal to go to Hank Rogers. And Pajitnov, of course, made the agreement that Rogers was a man with a plan, and he sure pulled it off in a unique manner. So either way you look at it, this film truly did give us the insight as to what the world of the Soviet Union, the United States, Japan, and England all came down to. It was one crazy Royal Rumble that went down in the late 80s, but because of how popular Tetris has gotten now, even to the point in which that there came along a 40th anniversary game called Tetris Forever, which I actually played pretty recently. It goes into detail about the story of how Pajitnov and Rogers got to where they were and how they would reunite after 40 years since the game's original creation took place in the year 1984. It was of course first made by Pajitnov on various computers that he utilized, and with the parentheses marks. Yeah, basically before they created those actual tetraminal blocks that were famous in the game, they actually utilized the parentheses as stand-ins for the blocks because they didn't exactly figure that part out yet. There were also other games that came along, including a hat variation where you had to stack hats on top of each other, as well as a game called Go. It's basically a ninja style game in which you have to surround ninjas with your own and try to collect as many of them as possible. I found that to be pretty good just as well, but Tetris is pretty much the real deal. But Go was actually a part of it as well, due to its release on the Famicom, a thing that had been around for some time. In 1988, it was indeed at its peak. But then the Super Famicom would come around. Then, of course, with the Super Nintendo, which is the North American equivalent, as well as the Sega Genesis and many other consoles that would come around, a whole lineage of Tetris games would all come around and truly give us a 40th anniversary celebration that I highly recommend you try out. Yeah, so Tetris Forever was one of a kind. And I'm more than glad I went through it because about a couple hours worth of interviews and stuff with Hank and Alexei all together, that's just incredible. The kind of relationship between the US and Russia, I'm glad at how well things have improved between both sides. We're practically like friends at this point. And I hope they do stay like that. Even if both countries aren't exactly going to be perfect. Well, that in mind, though, that's it for this piece. I will say that Tetris is a film that's worth watching, especially if you're a fan of Edgerton. Or, of course, if you like the kind of attention to detail, like the actual Russian actors that were in there. In any case, though, I give this film a good 8.5 out of 10.1. So, I feel like I haven't really been as stingy, but also not as heavy-handed on the scoring as possible, which at least is appropriate, given the fact that every film is different, but my viewership on them will at least guarantee a good review for any video that I make on this channel. And so, I'll be back tomorrow with another piece, probably a few decades before. So, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side for more.